Welcome to Cheese in Depth. I'm Michael Landis, and today I have Zoe Brickley with me, and we're going to talk about four of her special cheeses, but also talk a little bit about Jasper Hill. And so, before we get going, though, as American Cheese Month, I'm going to ask Zoe a very important question. What was your first experience at ACS? Zoe?
Okay, so that takes me back. That was 2008, I think, was my first one, and it was in Burlington, Vermont. And at the time, I was working at a cheese shop in New York City, and I was assisting the buying team with American cheeses. And I thought that was a really exciting job. So the idea of getting to go to the American Cheese Society conference and meet cheesemakers in real life was so exciting for me. I was kind of fresh out of school, and this was like my first real job. And I came all the way up to Burlington. And I remember I grew up in the woods kind of, and then I was living in New York City and sort of wide-eyed and like overwhelmed. And I just remember getting to Vermont and like breathing in the Vermont air. And I remember every time we had a break from programming, there was a hiking trail like behind the hotel, and I would like hop out and like do a quick lap around in the woods and come back. And so it may not surprise you that I ended up moving to Vermont just a few years later to work for an American cheesemaker where I am now. And I'm sure that's one of the first times that I met Andy and Mateo Keeler, and the rest is history. So gosh, that was a very prophetic question, Michael.
All right.
Okay, so I guess without further ado, that's a great segue actually into what I'm going to talk about today. I have loved my time in Vermont. That was 12 years ago that I moved up here. And on this landing slide here, you can see Jasper Hill Farm kind of as it is today. We're in what's called the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. So I think a real estate developer coined that 100 years ago to try to sell property in literally the middle of nowhere on the Canadian border and like a subarctic climate zone. So it is very beautiful and sparsely populated, very bucolic, very agricultural. So there's not a lot of development. There is a lot of farmland and woods, thankfully. So the story begins here with the barn, the blue barn, which has been muralized in this picture. Didn't always look like that. It was a little worse for wear when the Keeler family bought it in the late 90s. And around that time, it was kind of what's happening now, where houses are getting snatched up off the market as soon as they go on by people who are kind of transitioning away from the city, maybe into the countryside. So that was sort of happening. And Andy and Mateo were seeing in the little mini lake town that they'd grown up summering. And I think the Keeler family's been coming up here for 120 years or something crazy like that. They actually grew up in Bogota, Colombia. Their dad was doing business there. So they never had a hometown in the US except for this place they would go to summer and spend time with their grandmas. So this was their childhood happy place. They decided they wanted to put down roots and make a living here, but it's not the kind of place where you just go down to town and get a job at the software development firm or whatever. It's definitely the kind of economic landscape where you are actively engaged in like making, growing, doing, building things, and especially agriculture, as I mentioned. So they were seeing, sort of like pieces of land and properties kind of like going fast, and they kind of made an impulse decision to pool their life savings and get a little help from their folks and buy what was at the time kind of a rundown dairy farm during a time where that wasn't a super attractive thing. So while homes were getting snatched up, dairy farms in particular were sort of available. It was kind of like what you could get. And it's because in the late 90s, especially, commodity milk prices were dipping. And when you milk cows and you sell liquid milk, the price you get paid for your milk depends on what's happening in the commodity market. And in Vermont and New England, the average herd size is about 100 cows. And in California, it's 900 cows. And you're competing with those big farms out west through that commodity structure. And so it can be, because that price fluctuates a lot, it can be really difficult to count on what you're going to be making from month to month and year to year. And some years you'd be doing great and saving up for your kids to go to college, and then and other times you could be losing money literally with every gallon of milk that you sell. So there was slumpy milk prices for a while. It was a bad scene. And small farms like this were going out of business. I think a third of the farms in town went under the year that they bought this farm. So that was the opportunity. The farms were available, but of course, the challenge was making it a profitable business. And so from the get-go, they decided they weren't going to sell liquid milk. They weren't going to participate in the commodity market. So what else can you do with cheese? You can make it into a value-added product. And Vermont at the time was pretty supportive of that idea, and still is. They sort of recognize that these small special dairy farms maybe aren't going to compete in liquid milk, but that value-added agriculture is a really appealing model. So they built the kind of tan house connected to the barn there, and that they made a creamery on the ground floor. They made some aging caves in the basement, and the 2 floors you can see sort of above the edge of the red shed there. That's where Mateo, one of the 2 brothers, Mateo and Andy are the brothers here, where Mateo and his family still live. So all the cheese and cows and people sort of in this continuous structure was the plan. And this is a picture of the family, especially in the early days. On the left-hand side, on the lower right-hand corner is Andy Mateo this past summer. So from the beginning, they had this idea for value-added agriculture, and they had to kind of learn it the hard way. And so they got a lot of help from neighbors. They also got some chuckles out of the neighbors, like, these guys don't know what they're doing. This is a tough time to be a dairy farmer. And so they kind of fought their way through it. That's Andy Keeler there, who in the beginning especially was in charge of the cows and the pasture from the beginning. These were pastured cows, rotationally grazed through the field, so that every time they finished a milking, they would go out to a fresh paddock of grass. And the theory is, if you don't overgraze any one spot, the grass is the most productive possible. And especially if you can graze it at the right interval, you actually get more grass at the end of the year than if you would just let it go. So that's New Zealand style rotational grazing. So they were like doing their homework, and they're like, okay, we're going to do that. We're not going to sell milk, because they never had a bulk tank or a place to store it or a place to sell it if they didn't make cheese. So Mateo, very busy being the head cheesemaker, keeping that going. And man, they were really tied to this building. You have to milk those cows every day, and you had to make the milk into cheese or lose it. Angie Keeler, Mateo's wife here, with her baby bump. That baby bump just got their driver's license. Reed Keeler, it's sort of unbelievable, but true. So this is 2003, and she was helping with cheese making and also keeping the books and helping track down orders every week. I remember around this time, a couple of years into it, I was at that cheese shop in New York and assisting, being the assistant buyer, and I would call to place my order with Jasper Hill, and Mateo would answer and be like echoing and splashing. And I was like, dude, if you're in the bath, I'd call you back. Of course, I'm a dummy. He wasn't in the bath. He was in the vat. He was in the cheese house with the headset on, actively making cheese, watching a clock, marking important intervals on a whiteboard while answering the phone, taking orders, or selling cheese. Kind of calling the orders out to Angie, who was in the office, trying to keep track of them. And at the time, they were making such a small amount that they weren't getting a refrigerated truck to show up and take it off at a pallet at a time. They were packing individual boxes. So that's where Victoria Keeler, Andy's wife, also probably pregnant in this photo, was down in the caves, caring for each individual piece of cheese, packing individual cheeses into small parcels, and then sending them directly to shops and restaurants. So that's a lot of work. They had over 200 customers as a tiny business selling a fraction of the cheese that we are now. Now we've got maybe 30 main customers because we work with distributors. But back in the day, they were working directly with those influencers of the market. And that was actually, there's pros and cons to that. And the pros were, they were able to interface with those tastemakers, with those people who were building the American cheese scene. The American cheese scene is much more developed now than it was 20 years ago, and even, you know, even though it was just sort of picking up steam back in the early 2000s, they even had a head start over pioneers in Vermont like Allison Hooper with Vermont Creamery, who was, you know, milking some of the first goats commercially in the country ever in the 80s. So this is kind of second wave of artisan cheese, we'll call it. And it was tough going, but they were finding some success. They like to say that the best investment that they made in the beginning of their company was throwing away the first 30 batches that they made, because it just didn't represent them well. It wasn't what they were going for, and it was tough to swallow because they, you know, weren't having conventional income. But when they did finally introduce cheeses to the market and they got those buyers on the phone, they had a decent cheese at least to offer, and they developed a reputation pretty early on as having high standards and doing a totally legit operation. So it was working, although it was tough. And then the story takes like a weird turn. But before we get to the first twist of the story, I think we should eat some cheese. But this is a little glimpse into the creamery where we're making this cheese. So these are our Ayrshire breed cows. This the original herd that we started with at Jasper Hill. This is the barn pre-mural. You can see it kind of needed a makeover there. And then next to the barn, the cheese house here. And in the ground floor, we have what's called a tip-up system. So this vat in the corner is a typical small artisan cheese making vat. It's hard to make soft cheese consistently in it. So we got these tip-up bins, they're called. So we're kind of making 10 little mini batches of cheese all at once because it was taking too long to bale the curds. The first curds we got out of the big vat were perfect, but by the time we finished 30 minutes later, they're sort of overcooked, and the textures of the cheeses from the beginning to the end were really different. So this way we stagger the cutting and the stirring and the renneting of each bin by like 10 minutes. So this bin is perfect and ready to go. You turn the crank, tip up system. You can see why it's named that. Someone gets a face full away while they help distribute it. We now have a fancy sort of stainless steel slide that helps do that motion, sort of sort out the curds for you. Little baby steps here. But they're moving the curd into those cups underneath that plate that helps make sure you don't lose too many curds. The curds seize up after they're separated from the whey, and they kind of wiggle themselves into place, and then they'll replace them with the next layer. So then as they're kind of resetting, that next bin is getting ready, and by the time they're set, the next bin is perfect. And so you get these sort of a brigade of these exactly ready bins in a row. It's kind of counterintuitive that making multiple batches at once gives you more consistency than one big batch. So you can see the next morning, these are rubbery. Evan's not being too careful with handling them because they're pretty sturdy, and it's over that ripening period that they get soft because of the rind. But they're going in a brine tank to get salted. Now we use dry salt, long story, but here's Ron in the woods doing his thing, right? He used to be known as Ron the logger because he'll do this land management and kind of select and pull trees, but now he's Ron the stripper. You can see why. He's smart, so he gets paid to manage forests responsibly and sort of thin out spruce stands, and then he gets paid for the bark, and then he can sell the wood too. So there he is with his X-Acto knife tool making those strips. We dry them when we need to use them in the cellars. We put them in a big pot and boil them to make them flexible and to kind of sanitize them, and then affix them to the wheels there, and then we take them into the cellars. So I didn't get to the part of the story about the cellars yet. That's the twist that's coming up. This crazy 22,000 square foot underground building. It's just around the corner from those early days that we were talking about. But this is the Bloomy Rind Cave. A lot of different cheeses that all like the same temperature and humidity, so they live together in there. They get patted and turned as their rind blooms. And you can see in this sort of series, I lined up different ages of the same cheese, so you can see that rind form and get puffy, and then get patted down, kind of compacted, so it stays nice and tight with the cheese. And then I actually unwrapped this after it was chilled, probably, because it only needs to spend a couple weeks in the cave, and then we can chill it down and start getting it out to the different parts in the market, and it ripens in the refrigerator, basically. So even if you buy a wheel of this cheese and it's a little firm and not gooey yet, you can hold on to it and it'll keep ripening even in your fridge. It's designed to do that. So we can get it on its way to California and have it still be developing flavor. So how did we get from 4 young people knocking themselves out, trying to do everything, spoiler alert here, to this crazy underground cave system where we're aging cheese for other producers and for more of our own creameries? So Cabot Creamery is right up the road from us. If you have ever been in a grocery store in the Northeast, you're familiar with the Cabot brand. It is like the standby everyday cheddar, really high quality. They win tons of awards, but it's a different kind of cheese than what you'd find in a cut to order counter in the artisan cheese world. But they're paying attention certainly to what's going on in the market. They love great cheeses, and they would go into these cheese shops and see their cheese right there in the dairy case. And then in the cut to order counter, they would see like an imported British cheddar. And, you know, a monger there, like hand tasting it out, and they're like, but we want our cheese to be there. But the barrier to entry into the artisan set for them was really the cave aging. It's growing natural flora on the outside of the cheese, and that's pretty antithetical to the tight ship that they run in their production facility. They actually measure the spore load count in the air and have filtration systems to keep it very mold free. So this wasn't really like their MO. So they reached out to the Vermont cheesemaking community and said, hey, anyone want to, you know, put a rind on our cheese? And Andy and Mateo were like the only ones who got back to them. And we're like, yeah, we'll grow mold on that. And so they got some wheels in the basement of the farmhouse, did some ripening for a year, wrapped them with cloth, and you rub them with lard. And then a year later, it was great, but it wasn't a good fit for the Cabot sales team. They were selling truckloads of cheese into different places in the market. And so, you know, Andy Mateo kind of like anxiously waited to see how that first batch went in the market, because it was a nice little rent check every month for them to take care of and get those affinage kudos. And they were like, oh, it was really fun. You know, we're definitely going to serve it at the company party, but, you know, we probably won't keep doing it just because there's too expensive and small production and esoteric. And thanks anyway. And Andy and Mateo were like, well, wait, do you need any help placing it? Because meanwhile, they're on the phone with those like 200 influencers in the market every week taking orders. And there wasn't really an American cloth pound cheddar at the time. So they sort of convinced Cabot to let them try to place some. And they were able to, you know, place the extra wheels, no problem. Everybody was sort of scrambling for it. Jasper Hill and a cloth pound cheddar, yeah, let's do it. So they entered it in the American Cheese Society conference, centered in the story here, and it won Best of Show its first year on the market, which is like winning the Super Bowl your first year as a team. It's really an amazing thing. So that catapulted them to the next phase of the business within their first few years of existence. So by their 5th year of selling cheese, they had finished construction on the 7 vaulted underground 22,000 square foot ripening facility, which is just sort of hard to imagine from those early days phases. But what it really allowed them to do was get enough large format Cabot cloth pound that's made in the bigger production facility up the road at Cabot onto the shelves and then onto pallets. And that's when they could get a refrigerated truck to show up. That's when they could start having conversations with distributors. They had enough cheese, enough weight to sort of get into a national distribution network, and then they could sprinkle their small production cheeses on top. And that's when they started thinking to themselves, okay, who else has cheese that could, you know, piggyback on this pallet and ride out to market instead of doing all of that high touch, direct consumer, expensive packaging, hard to control the temperature of shipping. So this was really a breakthrough for the company and allowed us to take it to the next level. So here's just a couple more scenes from the caves these days. We saw the Bloomy Rind cave in action. This is what we call the ellipse, sort of the hallway in between the vaults, which is a very bustling place. Here's like the lab technician taking some compositional data, measuring the pH and moisture of a developing batch. There's Mateo in his underground bunker masterpiece. We have the lift here that we use to get cheese up and down from the tall shelves, and then you know, our natural rind cave where, you know, Bayley, Hazen, Blue would live, and our tome styles. So just a couple snapshots of what that facility looks like today, and it's really been greatly impactful in our rural area, being able to get our cheeses farther away from home into metropolitan areas, take the cash from those sales, and then reinvest it in our local area has been has had a huge impact on our community in a positive way. So we're really proud of that, and that's our whole MO, is just like building pipelines to where the people are, and then bringing the resources back here. We actually track our expenses by zip code, and we measure over time, you know, how far away the dollars spent go, and we try to keep that as tight as possible to have the biggest impact as we can in a close place. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the decisions that we make to make sure that our cheeses are as delicious as possible. And so we are really committed to the process all the way down to the grass. So we're not just buying any old milk or having the tanker truck stop by. You know, we're making our own milk from our own cows. We are at the point now where we're able to support at least 2 small farms nearby, so that 50 cow farm size as our original farm is. And in fact, a farmer named Tom Hill has some adjacent land, so it's a long walk, but you could get to his farm from ours. And in the early days when they were like winging it and just figuring out like how to milk cows, whenever they would hit a rough patch or have a calf, you know, difficult calving, or just, you know, not know what they were looking at, they could always call Tom. And Tom is just such a generous dude. He would stop what he was doing on his own farm and come up and help them out. And it was a wonderful day when they were finally able to sort of like pay that forward and give back and offer to purchase his milk for a set price that was much better than the commodity milk price and dependable, with quality incentives. So we're already, you know, just to give you the milk you're already making, give us the milk you're already making, we're going to pay you more. And if you can do these things to make it more customized for cheese milk, you know, there's even room for improvement. And so now Tom's able to send us all of his milk, totally unhitched from the commodity market, and that's been transformative for his business. You know, he's got a better shot of one day being able to retire or transition the farm to one of his kids. And in fact, one of his kids married another dairy farmer in the area. It's kind of thing that happens around here, his daughter. And so Dan and Emily now are milking cows up the road. They bought a farm, and part of the reason why it was attractive for them to buy the farm is that we were buying some of that farm's milk, and they knew that they would have a customer in us that could pay a steady price. It was easier for them to go to the bank and say, like, we're not banking on the volatile commodity market, like we've got a steady home for this milk. And that was a really rare instance of farm transition. It's hard to get young people interested in becoming a dairy farmer in Vermont these days. And so whenever there's a little success story like that, where you can transition a farm from one generation to the next, everybody gets really excited about it. So those are 2 small farms that we're able to purchase milk from. We still only make our raw milk cheeses from our own cows. So milk from Tom Hill and his daughter Emily's farm would be going into our pasteurized cheeses like Harbison and Willoughby. So this raw and pasteurized thing, what does that really mean? So with a pasteurized cheese, before you start making the cheese making process, you're heating up the milk to above 140 degrees, and then you're cooling it back down to the body temperature of a cow, which is like in the 90-degree range, right? And that 90-degree range is the happy place for cheese making microbes to start doing their thing in the vat. So you can milk your cows and take that warm milk right out of the cow, put it into the vat, and just start making cheese. And that's what a lot of small scale artisan producers do. Or because of the federal 60-day rule, and just because of people have different milks and some is more or less suitable for making raw milk cheese, you might choose to heat your milk up, cool it back down, and then you've narrowed greatly the number of microbes that are there in your milk to start with. And that is reducing your risk profile and making, kind of opening up more possibility for different cheeses that you can make without worry and with much smaller risk. So when you want to make a raw milk cheese like we do, we have to be very tuned in and controlling of the whole process down to the pasture, the environment the cows are in, the barn, the bedding that they lay in, And whatever cows are eating is like all over their body. So a great way to control the microbes that get into the milk. And the way microbes get into the milk are like from being on the teats and in the air and in the hands of the milker. All those kinds of points of origin, is to be really particular about the feed. And so if you've ever driven through upstate New York or the New England, and you see those big white marshmallows sitting in the fields, they look like, that's freshly harvested, beautiful green grass that's being wrapped up into an anaerobic situation, so no oxygen, and it spontaneously ferments. And that fermented feed is really good for cows. It's probiotic, it preserves the nutrients. It's a lot easier to harvest fresh grass. It could be raining and you don't really care. But the microbes of fermented feed can really mess with your cheese recipe, especially depending on what kind of cheese you make. So we were buying dry hay from drier climate areas and like trucking it to Vermont, which is goofy because we're surrounded by nice green pastures everywhere. It was just really hard to bank on 4 days of continuous sunshine at a low relative humidity. It like rains every 30 seconds here. So we built a hay dryer to be able to make nice dry hay. I have a slide for that coming up, but that has a much different microbial profile that's much better suited for raw milk cheese making. So in the Alps where Gruyere and Comté are made, it's illegal to use fermented feeds because that cheese is very susceptible to the sort of problems that are associated with it. If you're making a pasteurized cheese, it's not that big of a deal. But for us, we take the path of more resistance. We've also transitioned to non-GMO feed based on customer interest and feedback. So we do supplement the grass diet, whether it's dry hay in the winter or fresh pasture in the summer, with some grains. That helps the cows make the most of their feed. Cows are doing a lot. They're making a lot of milk. They're basically only eating salad. And so a little bit of carbohydrates, a little extra energy helps them stay healthy, helps them put all their protein together in the udders and make milk that's really good for cheese making, and they really like love it. It's a treat. You can overdo it, it's more expensive, so farmers tend not to overfeed grain. I think the like grass-fed preference and concern from customers comes from the beef industry, where you've got indoor cows just like eating Cheerios all day, and customers like, we don't want that. But a dairy farmer would never do that because grain is way more expensive than grass. It's not going to put on marbled beef. There's no economic incentive for them to do that. In fact, it can cause long-term health issues. And if you're a dairy farmer, you want a cow to be in your herd for a long time and stay really healthy. So you measure the milk all the time and dial in exactly the right amount of grain to keep the cows healthy, make sure they have all the energy that they need without overdoing it. So it's a delicate balance, and we spend a lot of time trying to perfect that balance with the cows. That's TMI, I know, but it's like, it's a peek behind the curtain of all the stuff that our team is thinking about. We've got people on staff really honed in on that. So this is that hay dryer I was talking about. We harvest these big round bales. We put them on these holes in the floor. We push hot air up through the holes. It dries that hay down in what would take days of direct sunlight in just a few hours. And then we can put it up, and it's basically preserved for the winter. So we have James, who designed this building, with his hygrometer testing the moisture content of that hay to make sure that we've nuked it to the right level, and then we'll move it over to the storage shed, and we'll have food for the cows all winter long. All right, so Highlander raw milk cheese, really important to have this dry hay. The goats also eat the dry hay, and then like a special blend of grains and other things meant just for them, for their little goat selves. One last little geek out here with you guys. So I mentioned, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but we have a little mini lab on site, and we've been collecting microbes and figuring out what exactly they are and storing them in like a negative 50°C freezer for a rainy day. And we got into this, even as small cheesemakers, it's very unusual to be doing that kind of work. And we got introduced to those possibilities by working with Dr. Rachel Dutton and Dr. Ben Wolf, and they were at Harvard, and they had several years with access to a DNA sequencer, and they wanted to study microbial communities, how they form, how some groups of microbes will grow and make a better place to live for another group. So they kind of were watching microbial succession over time, and they chose cheese rinds as their model system. So you could just get soil samples, but it's kind of hard, it's too chaotic, it's kind of hard to parse out what's happening. Or you could just use a petri dish. That's kind of like too simple to really understand how these things would happen in nature. So cheese rind is sort of the perfect compromise between a petri dish and a soil sample. It's complex. There's room for diversity and for different things to grow, but it's also somewhat predictable. You know, every batch of cheese is a little bit different, but you can see results. You can learn from results over time. So this is the slide that like 5 years of their research resulted in. They called us up and they're like, hey, can we scrape your cheese rinds and your cave walls and like tell you what's growing there? And we're like, oh, you can do that? Like, we add the blue mold to the cheese, we add like the first yeast that we know is going to grow first on the rind and set it in the right direction. But otherwise, all of the other beautiful flora that populates the surface of a Bayley are volunteers. They're in our atmosphere, and we know that they're safe. Well, because you can see them, usually that's a good sign that it's safe, but also because we've created the pH and moisture and salt that is hospitable to the good guys. And there's really only like 1 or 2 things we'd want to be concerned about. And we test all over the entire process for those and make sure that they're not present in our environment. So we can rest assured that like we're growing this diverse, cool community of microbes that's going to have a positive or neutral impact on the cheese. And they looked at, one of them was a bacteriologist and one of them was a mycologist studying fungi. And so they kind of like divided and conquered, and they studied what was happening on these rinds over time. So they took like a baby Bayley and then one after like a couple days and then one after a week. And they did this repeatedly until that they could compile the data and see which microbes were growing over time. And you can see it's really successional. Some go first and then they transform the pH. They might unlock certain nutrients that were bound up in a more complex structures so that become food for another group of microbes that was just kind of like hanging out, not doing much. And then all of a sudden they kick in and start to do their thing and make a nice place for the next group to live. And so you can see it happening over time, but you can also taste it. This little blip of orange here, Cluveromyces lactis, that's actually a commercial culture that we buy, and it has its little heyday at that 21-day point. And KL, this yeast, eats whatever it eats, a protein or a fat or whatever, and it turns it into isoamyl acetate, which is what used for making banana flavoring. So Bayley rinds taste like bananas for like a week and a half at some point in its process. And then those kind of give way or, you know, become part of the harmony of other aromas happening. But you can taste it, you can see it. And in the end, you end up with a much more complex product than if this wheel was wrapped in foil or sealed in plastic and ripening anaerobically. So, you know, even a normal cheddar that you buy at the grocery store without a natural rind, that's still ripening. It's just happening probably in a colder place, sealed in plastic. So that ripening is totally anaerobic, just bacteria inside the cheese. So that's also happening in cave-aged cheese. And then you also get all of this influence from the rind. And then overall, you can end up with a more interesting, more traditional, I think more beautiful and more delicious cheese. So I think with that, let's see. That's all the geeky stuff I wanted to show you today. Michael's put together an awesome series of content for this month. If this is the first one that you've tuned in for, I highly encourage you to check out the other ones that he's put together. I'm going to do 2 more, one pairing chocolate and wine, and the other bourbon and some charcuterie. So we've got a lot of fun stuff coming down the pike. And you're also able to order a tasting set from Jasper Hill. That's going to be the same cheeses that we're going to use in different settings. So this was the story of Jasper Hill and the artisan cheese movement. And then in the pairing classes, we're really going to dive deep into the sensory properties of each cheese and pair them with other things. So you can pick up that tasting kit at jasperhillfarm.com/shop. And then there's a link to that specific tasting kit for these classes. So I'm so happy to be able to be here today to share the story of Jasper Hill and my love of cheese, obviously. And thanks for supporting American Cheese Month and American cheese producers all over the country. I hope you have a lot of fun tasting and learning more about it. Thank you so much, Michael, for having me.